In the early stages of the boat building here, they used to build the boats in areas where they had deep water and plenty of timber, as close to the timber as they could get because of the cartage of it. And they used to, keels, they used to often fall the log, the tree, and split the log out of it. And how they used to split it, they used to bore holes at certain distances along the log, and then it was split between the bored holes. A lot of the other timber they used to do similar, and they used to use the pit saw, have the pit saw out to cut the planks and the flitches. And they used to go into the hills and get the knees cut to shape, growing knees.
The Wilsons at Port Cygnet have been synonymous with ship and boat building for over 150 years. Right up until the 1940s, they were constructing vessels using methods employed for hundreds of years. Some of their creations included such magnificent schooners and ketches as Regana, Annie McDougall, Eva Lita and Myena, just to name a few. There were also a host of river steamers. Their output has been prodigious, probably the greatest of any family in Australia. Their story is well documented by Alex Graham Evans and Peter Wilson in Built to Last, which came out in 1997. It all began with John Wilson way back in 1863 and carried on through his sons Walter, Taz and Cliff. Their last vessel before retirement was the Derwent Hunter, launched in 1946. Some of their ketches were sold to Adelaide owners for use in the Gulf grain trade. In fact, the Gulf grain trade carried on longer than the Hobart timber trade, working right through to the mid-1960s. One of these was the One and All, built by John Wilson way back in 1878. She traded in the Gulf till 1970. I joined her in Portland in that year for her delivery trip to Sydney, calling it Eden. So I can say I've had a very tenuous link with the Wilson ketches. 15 years later, I interviewed Alan Wilson, seen here with a large clamp used in shipbuilding, for the book I did on the ketches titled The Tasmanian Trading Ketch, an Illustrated Oral History. The painting on the front cover is of the Alice, a Wilson-built vessel. 16 years later, in 2001, I had a chat with Alan's younger brother, Noel.
Grandfather started in the middle 1800s over on Martin's Point, across the bay there. He worked there till building several boats until the time with his sons, until they say that the water started to get shallow on account of the silting up. So he shifted here in 1898 to this spot here, Robley's Point. They built several boats there, and he died in 1912. And my uncle Walter with his brothers continued on until 1946, which was the last vessel they built here, the Derwent Hunter. Some of the vessels that were built here was the pretty boat, the Lena. Other vessels that were built here was the Lita May and the Eva Lita, and the Eva Lita was supposed to be one of the prettiest ketches of large ketches that he built.
And joined the Eva Lita. She was a delight. See her out of water, she had lines like a yacht, she sailed like a yacht. We were going across to Melbourne one trip, and at daylight, Alma Dopal was on the horizon ahead of us, and that night she was that far behind us. So that's how well the Eva Lita used to sail. She was a beautiful thing. I spent 2 or 3 years on the Eva Lita. She was a beautiful thing.
The Eva Lita was launched in 1923. Sometime in the 1930s, she came back to the Wilson yard for repairs. At that stage, she was trading to Adelaide. Timber up, grain back. A young Keith Wilson must have been tired of apprentice shipbuilding and decided to sign up for a bit of adventure. He is seen here in the middle of the photo Captain Roy Sims on the far left.
I remember the Myena. As a young lad going to school here, I used to occasionally walk down this side of the river, and Dad used to row home across the river, and he used to have the old dinghy which my grandmother had built for a wedding present, and that dinghy at the present moment is still at the Maritime Museum in Hobart. After the keel was cut and ready and squared up in the bush with broad axes, etc., they used to tow the logs in, or the keels in, with bullock teams to where they were going to build the boat. The keel was usually squared before it got to the yard or wherever they were going to build the boat, and probably finishing pieces like planing, etc., and marking would be done. Then it would be set up on a certain distance up off the ground with blocks. Then the stem would be usually, depending on the shape, whether it was straight or round, would be a piece of flitch which would be bolted on with a 4-foot to hold it down onto the keel. Stern post would be set up as well. Usually the frames were set up first, really. They started building the frames, and then when they got towards the bow section, they used what they put the stem up, and they used the cant frames in the bow of it because they were on an angle. And down at the stern post, they'd use half frames, one each side, whereas the frames in the body of the boat were put up as one piece. And they were double frames. The ones that I can remember being built were all double frames so as to get the strength. And they were adged to shape, and bevels were all put on at the same time as you were putting them together. After all the frames were set up, and the stem, etc., and the stern, you started planking. We always planked our boats with shutters, every second plank, so that the timber would dry out. Those that were on the boat would dry out while you were doing the other work, such as deck beams and those sort of parts of the boat. And then when the timber was sort of at a stage where it was dry enough, we used to build the shutters, which used to go in between. You get a tighter fit by building the shutters. I remember the Myena being launched. We all had a half holiday from school to come down and watch the launching, and several of us were allowed to go off, which was a great thrill. Some of the vessels that they built here were what they call passage boats, such as the Mary, the Irazoo. They were double-enders and quite reasonably fast under sail. They were built fairly shallow to get into the small areas to pick up fruit, etc. There was other ones like the Ewan Bell, Hero, and several others which I can't remember their names.
As I mentioned earlier, the Wilson brothers, Walter, Taz and Cliff, retired on completion of the Derwent Hunter in 1946. At about the same time, Taz Wilson's sons, Alan, Noel and Keith, entered business on their own account on a new site across the water at Gardiner's Bay. Their first order was to build the 60-foot auxiliary trader Shearwater for the Jacksons on Flinders Island, to be skippered by their son Les, better known as Wallaby. Their first freight was to deliver a school bus from Hobart to Flinders Island, which would be an unusual sight on the deck of a ketch.
We had the order to build the Shearwater in 1946, I believe. The father, Taz, designed her, and in 1946 he died, so my brothers Alan and Keith decided to continue on with the boat, or build the boat. At that stage, Walter, they had launched the Derwent Hunter and they were not doing any more work over there, so we the keel was brought here by a barge, which was brought into on a high tide, and along one each side, the keel on one side of the barge and the kelson on the other side. They were about 70 feet long and could not be transported by road. So after the barge left and the tide went out, we shored them up and dragged them up with an ordinary old crab winch. When they were set up and all the other timber was in the yard, which came by truck, Walter came over and helped Alan, who hadn't laid one of those types of vessels out before, and they built a platform out of the planking, which helped to dry, and she was laid out full size, and Walter showed Alan how to do the framework of it. And Cliff and Sid, Walter's two other, but they came and helped us right throughout the shearwater.
Walter Wilson was a keen photographer, which has left us with a wonderful legacy in his extensive collection of high-quality photographs, all taken on the old glass plate negatives.
Because Walter loved to take photographs, I remember him setting his camera up. We had shearwater sitting still sitting on the blocks, and Walter set his camera up round the beach. Now, to get the boat off the blocks, we used to have to wedge the cradle up with a series of wedges each side, driving them in with a 4-pound maul. And once the boat was lifted a certain distance off, maybe only enough to pull the blocks out, each section underneath where the block had to be anti-foul, and Mr. Jackson, the owner, was doing the painting in underneath as we took the blocks out. Because Walter had his camera set up, he noticed that the vessel had started to move, and he sang out, "She's moving." And with that, brushes and paint pots shot out from underneath, followed by Mr. Jackson. She only moved a little bit because there'd been a lot of rain, and the ground where we'd put the jog shores in and the weight had settled them back in, and that was because why she moved. But then after she'd stopped moving, he went back, finished painting.
From 1946 through to Noel's retirement in 1997, the Wilson brothers built over 40 fishing boats and yachts. The 75-foot Wilson's Pride was the largest. Noel's son Michael, with Warren Innes, carried on yacht building till 2014. The launch of the magnificent 8-metre Johann Anker-designed Varg ended the Wilsons' 150 years of ship and boat building at Port Cygnet. For more on Hobart's wonderful history of trading under sail, my DVD, Trading Out of Hobart, is available from the Maritime Museum of Tasmania on 0362341427.